everyone. So I'm recording this, or I'm starting to record this about a day or two after I posted my BBCAN1 players tiers ranking list, and it's interesting that I went through BBCAN2 very quickly. I haven't rewatched this season in like 7 years, so it's been longer than my last rewatch of BBCAN1 before the videos that I posted, and I think I said 6 years. It's interesting because I always had these two close together and I couldn't decide which one was better. And as I was watching this season, I was still going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth about which one is better. But I ultimately think that this season is better than BB Can 1. What instantly became noticeable to me during this watch was that the production is so much better. As you can tell that they got more money to produce this season, but it is not overproduced like most, if not all, of the global seasons. I do think that the gameplay is a bit more interesting in this season, but a large part of me thinks that it is worse because I feel like it's kind of cheap with how the game took place and how the second half of the season formed. We'll get more into detail about that later, and it has me feeling kind of confused about a lot of the players. And it's weird, I actually like more of the people in this season, but I remember more people from BBCAN 1. And I forgot about a lot of people in BBCAN 2 over the years, and some of them made it very far. Overall, I do think it is a better product than BBCAN 1, but in a way, it's kind of less iconic to me. Now I'm going into the week by week details, but I'm only going to talk about some of the notes that I mentioned, so it's not going to be a full-on recap. And then I will delve into the person who was booted during that week, and then I'll talk about how I feel about them overall. So week 1 starts with the introductions, which introduces the 5 people who will become the first 5 allies. Kenny being gay is made to be such a huge deal, especially because he doesn't look like the quote-unquote typical gay person. Take that however you will. Arlie continues the long line of young men being uber super fans who are trying to be like the BBUS legends of the first few seasons of BBCAN. Kenny strategically wants to hold back that he is gay, Andrew wants to get into a romance, Arlie wants to be liked by both genders, Sabrina wants to bond with the women with makeup and men with food. Of course, they align when they enter the house. Unfortunately, Sabrina doesn't really do much about bonding with the men with food, and Sarah just mentioned more about being a mom. Cal's intro makes him look very cocky and arrogant, and he calls his hair nappy. Like, what the F is that? I could go on about that, but I'm going to choose not to, just so I don't curse and say a bunch of awful crap. So, they really make Nick come off like some spiritual oddball, though she is aware that she annoys people, and she wants to leave her game up to Destiny, since she doesn't have a strategy. Aika talks about being a teen mom and how it made her grow up quickly. John talks about how he wants to be a hockey player, and Kyle even unbuttons his shirt once he enters the house, which isn't a good look. Adele's Islam religion is heavily pushed in the edit, where he mentions that he wants to be a comp beast, which he doesn't accomplish in the house. Netta comes off as cocky and claims that her strategy is to be nice, though she is easily irritated. And she also wants to align with someone who she hates, which she doesn't really do once she enters the house. Rachel's intro talks about how she hates ditzy blonde woman, and it instantly pans to Heather next, which is great foreshadowing about their season-long feud. Heather is the typical girly girl, and we hear nothing about her thoughts on the game. Paul is, quote-unquote, 43 years young, and is portrayed as a, quote-unquote, hip father. Andrew wants to win the first HOH to set the tone of the season. Adele starts shaking his butt to pander to Canada, which becomes a thing he does all season. Cal makes some horrid comment about how hot the girls are. Anik is the first person to drop out of the HOH competition. Paul makes a deal with the people, so John, Neda, Kyle, Adele, Kenny, and Rochelle, the ones who are remaining in the competition, for them to give him HOH. Sarah is rubbed the wrong way since he convinced her to drop earlier, and he told her that it would be no big deal, but he of course does this. Many people are sketched out by this move of Paul's. Paul is claiming that everyone is so gullible, and it's clear that Paul and Kyle are immediately getting close. Andrew mentions it a few times that he is worried about dropping out early as he's going to be nominated, and Anik feels safe, which she isn't. Andrew starts talking in a horrendous Jamaican accent, and people are claiming that he got too drunk the first night, so he's acting very obnoxious. Anik is not fitting in due to her spiritual rituals and doing random stuff in rooms. Paul talks in the HOH room, and people are thinking that he's acting like a godfather. Paul is clearly getting HOH-itis. It's clear to many that he's playing the game really hard and he wants to nominate the people who left first. He ends up nominating Anik, who's an outsider, and Andrew, who made bad impressions night 1, for eviction. Andrew easily wins the veto and Paul has to nominate someone else. Anik decides to do a relaxation ceremony, and it's made to seem like it's an attempt to stay, but I don't think that's the actual case. Everyone calls out Anik's attempt at trying to win people over, but Aika and Kyle make it clear that it's failing. Aika ends up laughing as she walks away. Paul mentions that she has to fake it to make it, and Aika ends up being the replacement nominee, which isn't explained well at all, and I don't believe the little clip that they showed of Aika was the real reason why she was nominated. Anik goes home in a unanimous vote, and she was not expecting it to be 11-0. Apparently, she tried not to be herself when she entered, which did not work, and was the first one to leave the competition. She did not listen to her own advice. So, I think Anik could have been an interesting character had she lasted longer, but from what I got, there really wasn't much to discuss of her as a game player, and she came off as very annoying. But we only really saw her for like 20 minutes, and she wasn't on the feeds. She did not have a strategy entering the house, though she gave herself some advice on to tone herself down, but she didn't do that. It didn't seem like she was in any alliances, and all of her random antics that she did, whether it was spiritual or just doing other stuff randomly in rooms, caused people to distance themselves from her and made her an easy target. I don't see her doing well if she were to be on another season, and I actually just don't have many thoughts on her. Compared to Kat, we see a lot less of her, and she will start the trend of the first boots being very poorly portrayed or invisible, essentially, and have no characterization, and have nothing in their gameplay explained. So, I didn't mention my general thoughts on week 1, and it's the standard week 1 where it's crap, because the format of week 1 in Big Brother Canada 1 is crap. As for week 2, I do think it is one of the better weeks of the season, and it's one of the most electric as well. Let's get right to it. So, no one really cares that Anik is gone, and many of them are pretending to be sad. We learn that Aika and Rochelle are aligned with one another. Andrew and Heather do not trust one another, as they BS one another in a conversation that they are having. Kenny told Heather that he doesn't trust Rochelle. Heather tells Rochelle, who tells Kenny. So Heather could have handled that a lot better. Many people do not trust Heather and see her as a rat. Apparently, there's a gender divide between the house. Andrew wants to win HOH and every competition he can in the game, which isn't a great strategy. Everyone starts targeting Sarah and Kyle in the HOH competition. Andrew, of course, ends up winning. Arlie tries to throw the competition. Rochelle and Heather BS one another in a conversation, and neither one of them like the other. Rochelle then bashes Heather to Aika and Neda. Andrew gives more details about the First Five Alliance and how it is secretive. He wants to target Paul because the latter has made alliances with everyone in the house, which they didn't show last week. Paul has a cry fest, and he wants to side with the girls to get out the likes of Andrew. Paul mentions that Andrew is sexist and racist, and we see some flashbacks that could support this, and Aika, who is the recipient of Andrew's quote-unquote urban and quote-unquote sounding black comments, doesn't see it as racist. Kenny and Arlie wants to go after Heather and Aika because they are some of the smarter girls, and mention to Andrew that Paul could side with the girls and they would have the numbers. Great read on Kenny and Arlie's parts. Kenny mentions that Cal needs to go because he is as physically fit as Andrew. Paul and Neda are nominated. They don't explain Neda being nominated at the episode at all. And Paul goes off on how Andrew is the most sexist and racist person in the house. Literally, the entire house yells at him, claiming that he is full of crap. Paul claims that Andrew isn't racist, but he's using it as a strategy so he could be a GOAT, which is really, really stupid since it's only week 2. And it's just an excuse for everyone to target him. So, him using it to become a GOAT is null and void. Paul rants about some of the guys' alliance. Kenny and John are then mad, I guess because he was saying some truth there. Sarah yells at him about some fake alliance that Paul offered her and Sabrina. There are feed videos on YouTube where the fight continues, and it overall evolved into the entire house yelling at Adele and Cal. Most of this was not on the episode, and it's one of my main issues with the season. They cut out a lot of the drama and fight, and I think it was because they're trying to push the quote-unquote Canadians are friendly image, which isn't true at all. Paul decides to apologize to Andrew, but the latter kicks him out and yells at him, stating that he does not want to speak to Paul for the rest of the time in the house. I will say that Tom handled this better when he was in this situation with Suzette during his HOH last season. Aika feels like Paul used her to call someone a racist, and she then starts yelling at Paul, especially because she also said that John was the whitest white guy she has ever met. It is interesting, since Aika would complain about racist treatment in the future with Big Brother Canada 5 and when she worked for ET Canada, which caused her to quit. Neda and John are paired together for some task, and it's interesting seeing them develop from this point onwards. Kenny convinces Andrew to go after Cal if the veto is used, and they then tell the entire house about the plan. Adele senses before the veto competition that he thinks there's a bigger plan, which is a great read on his part. Neda will be vetoed, and they'll put up either himself or Cal on the block. They realize what a mistake they made in consoling Paul, while the entire house ran the opposite way. They just made themselves into huge targets. Kenny wins the veto and is glad to continue his plan to backdoor Kyle. Neda is vetoed and Kyle is the replacement nominee. We see more of John and Neda's friendship developing, especially with how they bash and loathe Andrew while seeing through Sabrina's tactics. At this time, John is kind of a lackey to Andrew, Kenny, and Arlie, so I don't know if he was intentionally playing both sides or he was just still loyal to them but just very annoyed with Andrew. Neda is claiming that she doesn't want Cal to go home, since he would be one of the few to nominate Andrew. Cal ends up praying with Adele, and it's a very nice moment in the episode, especially with seeing how it bonded them. They and Paul start making fun of themselves as they spend their final days together, being isolated from the others. Sarah doesn't like the isolating element of the game, so she has a nice personal conversation with Cal. Cal is swiftly sent home in a 9-1 vote. I do think Cal had potential to be a great character. He was very natural in the diary room, and he definitely did have personality. As a player, he wasn't good. While I don't think he made many mistakes, especially compared to most of the pre-jurors and a lot of the jurors, he did come off as very arrogant and obnoxious while not having the allies to back it up, like Andrew did. And I remember a lot of the cast really, really, really hating him outside of the house, and it led to some of the stuff that happened inside the house. He also aligned himself with Paul very early on, clearly a lot earlier than the edit put emphasis on, and with Paul being such a mess, he just made himself a bigger target, since obviously he's a bigger target than Adele and Paul. It didn't seem like he campaigned much at all to stay. He didn't read the forest in the trees at some points in time, but I don't think he's an awful player overall. So we are moving on to week 3, and I do think this is one of the stronger weeks of the season, as there's just so much bad gameplay, and I love when bad gameplay is punished, essentially. There's a lot of moving parts, and just seeing the sheer stupidity that takes place is just hilarious to watch. And I couldn't keep my eyes away from watching the chaos that was happening. Aika wins the HOH competition, and Kenny is worried. Sabrina thinks that Aika will nominate Paul and Adele to target Adele because she told her to do so. Aressa tells the house guests that Allison is the new house guest that will be moving in and she is safe for the week. Apparently, Kenny met and saw Allison a bunch of times, something about Newfoundland being small, and he's worried because he thinks that she will out him for being gay. The lines are drawn between the genders, where Aika, Rochelle, and Nedas are nervous about Allison siding with Kenny. Kenny goes on about taking advantage of Sabrina having a crush on him, and we see this with him leaning to kiss her, and she does it. I believe he speaks to John and Andrew about it afterwards, to some extent. Adele and Aika game talk, where we learn that Adele and Aika are close, and they notice that Andrew, Kenny, John, and Arlie are a big foursome, but John is weak because he is injured. Aika is not receptive at all to making a big move, which Adele is encouraging her to do. Kenny and Andrew even notice that if Aika was a smart person, she would nominate the both of them. Aika talks with Rochelle and Neda about nominations, and Aika wants to put up Heather as a pawn. Heather just so happens to enter the room, and the girls go quiet, and then they mention Paul and Adele as a cover. Heather notices that she's the outside of the girls. Neda tells them, or at least tells the diary room, that it is idiotic to put up Heather as a pawn, and that they need to put up a boy. Sarah is also in the room, and she's of course in the first 5 alliance. Allison easily bonds with the guys, so she's leaning towards them. No one wants to volunteer to be a pawn because it is idiotic, and Aika is getting annoyed with Sabrina and Rochelle for not wanting to be a pawn. Neda thinks that Aika is being an idiot, which she is. There are so many feed clips that I found during this week where Aika makes them really mad and isolates her own allies. So this is just a little bit of that, but it would have been great if we saw more of her chaotic HOH-itis make it onto the edit. Aika nominates Paul and Heather for eviction. Aika reveals that Heather is her actual target, and she doesn't describe an actual reason for this, but she needs Paul to help her game, so why did she nominate him? Heather knew she was going on the block, and the first 5 alliance are starting to worry about Andrew and Allison's connection, as they hook up within a day of her entering the house. Sabrina is fine with Heather being the target, since she knows that the guys are targeting Paul no matter what. Adele reveals that he's been working with Aika for a few weeks, and they have something brewing, so he tells Paul that he needs to get it together. Paul is then told by Aika that he is the pawn, and that Heather is the target, so he's going to lay low. Sarah rats out everything the girls are doing to Kenny, where she tells him that the girls are not feeling Allison because she's clinging to Andrew, and the first 5 are not feeling the showmance. I think Sarah would have done much better in the game if she kept certain information to herself and not tell everything to Kenny. Heather ends up hurting her knee during the veto competition, and Aika ends up winning the veto. Andrew, Kenny, and all of them ambush her in the HOH room, and she tells them that she wants Heather gone, which they are not receptive to whatsoever. Kenny sees through Aika's plan and knows that she wants Paul to stay to go after him. Allison makes it clear that she would not be attracted to Andrew in real life, but she needs to trust someone, and this is her best bet. Andrew, Kenny, and John storm outside to rant about Aika's plan, like the entitled men that they are at this point. Sabrina wants Allison to leave next week, and Andrew gets mad when she mentions it to him. Adele wins a candidate's prize, where he has the chance to take someone's spot in an upcoming veto competition. I do think that once he won this prize, everyone realized that Canada liked Adele, so they kind of leaned away from him. So I think that's kind of benefited him without him doing anything. And there's so many other signs throughout the season that the house guests start making moves and doing things because they know Canada likes someone or dislikes someone. And I don't like that element in Big Brother in general. So Aika decides not to use the veto, and Paul has the feeling that he is going home. Netta narrates that the girls want to vote out Heather and that the guys want to vote out Paul. She mentions that the girls are too emotional, which is true, and it's why playing with the girls are so hard and it's so horrible in general, because they don't think strategically. And Netta is all about thinking strategically. At this point, Sarah is willing to vote with the girls because neither Heather or Paul are in her alliance, and it's really not a big detriment to the first five either way. Ika tells Paul that he needs to relax, and he states that if he does stay, he and Adele will be loyal to her, but him staying is based on the amount of Paul that she has in the house, which we will find out that it's 0. Paul and Adele notice that Ika is going to become a huge target after her HOH, so she needs them. Adele doesn't think that Allison will vote with the guys, bad read, while Paul tells him that she will. Adele tells the house that he has a power, but he exaggerates the amount of power that it has. It is also where the house realizes that Canada likes Adele, and maybe does not like them. Adele tells Ika the truth about his power, and she tells him to continue lying about it. Andrew knows that Sarah and Sabrina want to vote with Ika, since it is not out their alliance, but he doesn't give an F, and the power has him and Kenny nervous, but he wants to convince them to boot Paul either way. Kenny, Andrew, and Arlie convinces Sarah to vote out Paul. Netta makes it clear that she does not trust Sarah at all. Sarah should have stuck to her guns and voted out Heather, since it would have kept both sides trusting her. The girls would have still kept her on their side. It would have put her in a better position over Kenny and Andrew, and Kenny and Andrew would still need her as a game player and as an ally. This was one of her first mistakes. So Paul goes home in a 6-4 vote and thought that playing the villain card would do well for him, but it did not. He mentioned that trying to make too many alliances in the beginning and calling out Andrew in the nomination ceremony was his downfall. I definitely enjoyed Paul during his limited time in the house. He was definitely a unique character, and while he was chaotic, he was definitely likable, and he did have some good points about Andrew. And he had a decent read here and there, but he was too insistent on playing chaotically and trying to make himself a villain. But he didn't realize that people who do that go early, and the people who are usually taken as goats are usually the ones that are more passive, not aggressive. He was in the prime position as the first HOH to set up an alliance that put him in the upper tier of the hierarchy of the house, but he ended up blowing it. He also aligned with other outcasts, and he did too much too soon, and it backfired. Paul is definitely a bad player, and I don't see him doing well if he were on any other season. But he was still a great character and one of the more memorable ones. Week 4 is another good week in the Big Brother house, and it's another example of strategic karma. And it's interesting to see how dumb some of these house guests can get. And there's, of course, the infamous, iconic moments that no one who has watched BBCAN could ever forget. Let's just get right to it. Sarah tells everyone that she made the flip vote, and the 3 girls in Netta, Rochelle, and Ika are really pissed off. Sarah tries to pull Heather in, since she was the vote that technically kept her in the game. Heather thought that Sabrina and Ika were 2 people she was closest to, which is a horrible read on her part. Netta wants to make a big move in getting Andrew out of the house, and Rochelle wants to get out Heather again. Sarah knows she needs to win HOH because she exposed herself, but she ends up losing the competition to Rochelle. Netta talks to Rochelle and tries to get her to take out one of the guys, but Rochelle is not receptive to it whatsoever. Rochelle does not put up Andrew or Kenny on slop to weaken them, which Ika notices. John and Allison has their infamous tack where they have to get drunk without no one else noticing. Ika decides to snap at Heather after she's trying to convince Sabrina and Rochelle that it is stupid to target Heather, which she not only did last week, but less than 24 hours ago. Heck, less than 12 hours ago. Sabrina is protecting her 2 male allies, and Rochelle is not listening whatsoever. Sabrina tells Rochelle that the guys will come after Sabrina and Rochelle if they don't protect the guys, and she tells Rochelle that they should send Ika home if one of Allison or Heather comes off the block. I have no idea why Rochelle doesn't even question why Sabrina is going so hard to protect the guys. Sabrina ends up relaying all of this to Andrew, and Sabrina is bragging about how she is manipulating Rochelle without realizing that she's being manipulated by Kenny, but she's insistent on backdooring Aika, who alienated Sabrina and Rochelle on her HOH, but it wasn't shown on the show. Andrew goes to cuddle with Allison, despite knowing that their relationship is why she is in danger anyways. Adele and Aika are off by themselves, and he tells her to remain close with the girls, since the guys will steamroll if they are not close. He also tells her that she could be the backdoor nomination, which she is initially shocked by, but she later realizes that it is definitely a possibility. Aika talks to the girls and tries to repair things, but they are avoidant, and Aika notices the differences of their conversations last week and weeks prior compared to this week. Allison wins the veto. Heather actually had the chance to take the veto from her, but she idiotically didn't take it. Heather tends to do this a few times during the season. Aika tries to pick John's brain, but he gives her nothing to work with, so her gut is telling her everything that she needs to know. She fails to convince Rochelle to not put her up, so she ends up getting nominated after Allison vetoes herself. Sabrina tries to use her tears to get sympathy from John, but he doesn't fall for it, since he knows that she was behind what happened anyways. Heather and a few others notice Sabrina's tactics for being the snitch for Andrew and Kenny. Even Sarah and Kenny have a conversation where they will cut Sabrina first from the alliance if they need to, and none of them see her as the mastermind. It is here where they start to show why Sabrina is considered a goat, and they build on this for the rest of the season. Aika poorly tries to campaign to Kenny, but it goes nowhere, and she apologizes to Heather for treating her poorly throughout the season. John and Etta talk about their growing relationship with one another. Of course, there's the infamous letter shredding moment task, and I don't even need to say anything else about it. Easily one of the best moments in Big Brother Canada history, and it still holds up after 9 years, though you have Andrew and Kenny showing their A $ES. Aika goes home in an 8-1 vote. So, I struggle with Aika, especially in this season. While she does have a few entertaining moments, she's just mean. And it's a lot because she's one of the older people in the house. You would expect there to be some sort of maturity due to this, but it just wasn't there. And she really played abysmal game. Like, I truly forgot how horrendous and atrocious it is. She had a target on her back from the very beginning. People threw their microaggressions at her, and while she was aligned with the girls, it was clear that they bonded over being mean and nothing else. And they weren't even really that close enough to her where they formed final twos with her. Her HOH is truly one of the worst HOH reigns I've ever seen in Big Brother, and what makes it worse is that she knew that the people she needed to target, but she just didn't do it and cowered out for some reason, as she was playing way too emotionally and personally, as she didn't even make some sort of fake deal with Kenny and Andrew that would incentivize her to keep them around. She is an interesting character, though, and she would prove that she isn't atrocious as a player in the future, but none of that potential was shown here in this season. So now we are reaching the halfway point as we are entering week 5. And I'm going to be very blunt about it. This week is kind of crap. Of course, we had Canada's HOH, which did cause a huge flip in the house. But honestly, it feels very cheap to me because it wasn't something that the house guests did, and from their commentary that they made during the week and even after this week, and based on how the game was playing by the end of the prior week, it wasn't likely that the remaining house guests were going to get over on the first 5, at least at this point, and it didn't seem like what would become the sloppy seconds had the relations that would have caused them to form a counter-alliance by this point without Canada's HOH. When I envision a flip, I envision a bunch of players either at the bottom of the house or people in the majority alliance, but at the bottom of that alliance, coming together and flipping so they can get rid of the people at the top of the lines, and so they can better their positions in the house and change the dynamic completely. The drama is so riveting, usually because the people at the top, or the people who had their karma coming, could be angry at the people who flipped on them or betrayed them. But with this, the first 5 couldn't even be mad at anyone because no one in the house turned on them. It was mainly just Canada who did it. So watching Andrew just somber and sulk during the entire week was boring because no one backstabbed him. Canada did it, and he had no one to lash out. There it removed that element of drama that naturally would have been there if this was an organic flip. And while it was somewhat interesting watching everyone deal with how Canada perceived them, it just got boring after a while, and it did incentivize the players to continue playing based on who they think Canada liked, or who they know Canada liked. The people who would become a part of the sloppy seconds most likely wouldn't have been able to come up with this on their own without Canada's HOH, whether it was because they're just being naturally outplayed, or they weren't under the assumption of who would be liked or who wouldn't be liked, and they just weren't showing to be good players up to this point. There is no outplaying, outwitting, and outlasting in this element here, especially with this week, so I could have even enjoyed Andrew's downfall the same way. It causes me to have a hard time ranking a lot of the people who would make it to the latter portion of the season due to this. As players, it's going to be hard for me to do so, as it just all feels very inauthentic, and it's a shame that I feel this way. It is revealed that Canada is HOH, and of course people are worried and paranoid. Andrew immediately knows that he is going up, so at least he has some awareness about not being liked. Sabrina knows that Adele isn't going up because they know that he is liked, and many of the others are happy about it since they know Canada doesn't like the first five, or that's their assumption, that they dislike some of the first five. Arlie and John are ready to flip, but the latter only trusts Neda. They, especially John, predict that Sabrina will be the other nominee. Sarah is trying to convince herself and Sabrina that their alliance is likable to Canada, but it does seem like she has an inkling of what's going to come. Arlie ends up speaking with Sabrina, and she's asking him if she will be nominated. He lies and thinks that she won't, but they end up claiming that Andrew and Alison will be the ones that are nominated. Arlie talks to himself about seeing where he will go after the nominations, but he's hoping to flip with two of Andrew, Kenny, or Sabrina going up on the block. He's claiming that the house will be his in 2 weeks, which, as we know, he ends up going home in 2 weeks. Neda and John are game talking, and they mention that Kenny knows that Andrew is hated. Neda mentioned that she was planning on coasting for a few more weeks before making a big move, meaning that if she had won HOH this week, most likely she wouldn't have made the move herself. And that's the sentiment that I feel about a lot of the people that would become a part of the sloppy seconds, making this feel cheap to me. The twist has woken Neda and John up, and now they're closer, want to work together, and now want to make big moves. Sarah and Kenny start bashing Andrew and are getting more and more annoyed with him, but the two of them have gotten a lot closer personally and strategically. Andrew is saddened because he doesn't want to go out by Canada, but Alison tells him to calm down. Andrew and Sabrina are nominated by Canada. The first five realizes that Canada does not like their alliance, and Arlie is really hyped about flipping to the other side of the house. John and Adele are more than thrilled. Sarah, Arlie, and Kenny realize that they cannot use their veto on Andrew or Sabrina, since one of them will likely be the replacement nominee. Kenny leaves, and Arlie tells Sarah that they need to have a backup plan and distance themselves from the alliance. All of them deal with Sabrina and Andrew melting down about not being liked, and that being why they are nominated. Andrew starts snapping at Heather because she did not pick Kenny to play in the veto, though he doesn't realize that Kenny wouldn't have even used the veto if he played and won it. He keeps on calling her a dumb bee, though they've never been in an alliance towards one another or had a positive relationship with one another. She talks to Neda and Adele about it, and they start pulling her into their side. Arlie essentially does the same thing, and the other side starts forming. John ends up winning the veto, and Neda throws yet another competition, as she's thrown most of them up to this point to appear weak. Andrew and Alison have a bunch of sad showmans screen time. Arlie and John officially align to take down the house, and the first five have a cry fest, where Andrew is resigned to going home. John, of course, doesn't use the veto. Sabrina claims that she isn't campaigning while she is campaigning, which is by crying and whimpering. Andrew decides to not campaign, most likely because he knows he's done, but claims that he can't campaign against Sabrina. The edit tries to soften him like they did with Tom last season. Kenny tries to strengthen his relationship with Arlie, and the latter BS's Kenny, since he sees them as the two bulls going at it. And I don't know if this was really an accurate read, to be honest. Arlie hangs out with the first five to make them comfortable, and Kenny flirts with Rochelle to get her to reveal information to him. Kenny ends up telling Sarah that he is gay, and it ends up being a moment for them. Andrew gets evicted in a 7-2 vote. Honestly, what is there to even say about Andrew? He is essentially a Tom clone, but I do think that he is a better player than Tom. Since unlike Tom, he didn't have his entire alliance turn on him, especially prematurely, and they kind of had to with this twist, so it wasn't natural like it was for Tom. And he also made it farther than Tom, and without this twist, I do think he would have lasted a few more weeks at the very minimal. He used his HOH better than Tom did, who was very emotional about it, and while Tom handled the Suzette conflict better than Andrew dealing with the Paul conflict, I do think that he's a bit more strategic than Tom. They both share the same amount of ignorance and problematic commentary, and he isn't one of the more interesting pre-jury villains who has a rise and fall in BBCAN and BBUS. Overall, he filled his role decently, I guess, but he wasn't one of the more charismatic or entertaining ones to me. And now we're moving on to week 6, and I wished they'd started jury this week, but since they didn't, it makes this one of, if not the longest pre-juries in Big Brother history. And honestly, the week itself is just a bore. It's just the after effects of Canada's HOH, and with the sloppy seconds forming, they just do what they're going to do, which is take out the strong members of the first 5, and nothing of interest really happens. One of, if not the most boring weeks of the season. So the HOH competition happens, and the audience cheers when the first 5 gets taken out. Again, this just incentivizes the sloppy seconds to stay together, and it's ironic since it benefited Neda here, though it would be the opposite case in Big Brother Canada 5. Heather ends up winning the HOH competition, and everyone knows where everyone stands. Heather wants to backdoor Kenny, but Adele convinces her to put him up outright. Dumb move on his part. Sarah and Kenny realize that they have to pitch in alliance with John and Neda to save themselves. Sarah is on to Artie playing both sides, good read on her part, and he doesn't really talk himself out of it. We get a funny moment of everyone pretending to care about Heather's HOH letter, and she can see them rolling their eyes in the mirror that's around the HOH room. Sabrina admits that she will vote out Rachel if she is nominated against Kenny, so Rachel aligning herself with someone who isn't even her number 1 and taking it Ika for her was stupid. LOL. Kenny does a last-minute pitch to Heather, but of course she isn't buying it. He goes to John, since he knows that John is up Heather's butt and that he's really making all the choices, but John isn't buying it. They show a flashback of a week or 2 earlier of John trying to reaffirm his loyalty to Kenny, and Kenny mentions that John is going home after John left. According to the feeds, John thought Kenny was his number 1 or number 2, but he was told by Arlie, I think, that Kenny wanted him out, and this is around the time that Kenna's HOH was approaching, so this was during the week Ika left. And John's target was really starting to grow. So it seemed like John was going to get got until Kenna's HOH saved his butt, and I think that's why he became resentful of Kenny. Rachel follows Heather to talk to her, campaigning to not go home, since she thinks she will go home against Kenny, which is a correct read on Rachel's part. Allison is not over Andrew's eviction and is essentially sulking. Allison and Kenny are nominated for eviction. Arlie mentions that he is trying to look out for Sarah despite being aligned to the other alliance, since she was his closest person for a while, and everyone realizes that Allison is the middle person. Allison tells Heather that she was never in the first 5 alliance, which she figured out based on who Andrew always hung around with. Everyone is trying to get Allison on their side. Kenny ends up winning the veto, and Sarah vocally and physically celebrates it by running into his arms, if I remember correctly. Both of them almost immediately realize that she made an error, which the others noticed it as well. Artie is hurt because he thought Sarah was closer to her than Kenny, but he's now fine with Sarah going home at this point. So this kind of seems like a revenge move on Artie's part, which I don't think was the best case scenario. He should have pitched for Sabrina to go home here, where he would have at least had Sarah on his side and in his beck and call. Kenny gives Heather a bad 1-week deal, and John suggests for Heather to nominate Sarah. Allison ends up finding the secret veto, and Kenny also knows that Artie flipped. Seems like even Sabrina is distancing herself from Kenny and Sarah. Of course, Kenny vetoes himself, and Sarah is nominated in his place. Arlie decides to tell Sarah the truth and be more honest about voting her out, and she is shocked because he won't even give her the opportunity to campaign to him. Allison tells Sabrina that she has to work with the other side since they are the ones who are keeping her safe. I don't know how I feel about this move of Allison's. The six in the majority name their alliance the Sloppy Seconds. Nanda ends up sabotaging Kenny's condiments so he could be weak as possible for the next H competition, which is very funny and very smart, since he was a have-nots during this week. Kenny decides to tell everyone in the house that he's gay, and yeah. He felt like since he's target number one, there's no purpose in hiding it anymore. Sarah campaigns to Neda that her alliance is after John and Arlie, and she will vote to keep John for Neda. Neda reveals that she doesn't trust Allison, and Sarah goes home in a 4-3 vote. I actually do think that Sarah was playing well throughout most of her run, and I think she would have done a lot better if it wasn't for Canada's HOH screwing her over. And even in this week, it didn't seem like she was a target, and I don't know if she would have been the replacement before the veto competition, but from the way the edit portrayed it, it really seemed that her hugging Kenny was her big mistake. I also think that her voting out Paul instead of Heather was a bad move, but she did end up recovering from that, and she rebuilt the bond she had with the people she screwed over, so that's an indication of her good play. As a character, she wasn't really interesting, and there's not much to discuss, but I do think she was a solid to good player who got screwed over. It is the double eviction, and I mentioned in my last video that I love how BBCAN does pre-jury double evictions, as it just gets rid of the fodder and speeds things up. So, Allison tells a crying Kenny in the storage room that the house is planning on backdooring him and that he needs to win HOH. It's interesting that she was playing both sides and at least wanted to keep things balanced. Neda ends up winning the HOH competition, though she didn't want to. But Arlie blatantly threw it, like Alec did in the double eviction last season, and it was a mistake on both of their parts. And she nominates the Gremlins, Sabrina, and Rochelle to backdoor Kenny. Arlie wins the veto, takes Rochelle off the block. Kenny is the replacement and is sent home in a 5-1 vote, though Allison claims to have considered using her secret veto on Kenny. I honestly do think Kenny is a good player, or a pretty good player, and he's arguably one of, if not the best pre-jurors in BBUS history. But because the pre-jury was so long in this season, and someone who went out in his placement is usually a juror, so we could easily compare him to early jurors. There are moments where he was likable and sensitive and could talk to many different types of people, but there are other moments where he broke down with Andrew and just came off like a complete a-hole, so he went up and down pertaining likability, in my opinion. I do think he is similar to Emmett in the way that they're the less douchey counterparts to their duos, but I do think he leaned into Andrew a bit too much compared to Emmett and Tom, and Emmett benefited from Tom leaving earlier, which Kenny didn't. Emmett knew when to pivot away from Tom, but Kenny wasn't able to know when to pivot away from Andrew. When it comes to the strategy, he was pretty good strategically. He knew how to talk to many different people. He knew how to get information out of people. He knew the motivations of other people, whether they were aligned with him or whether they weren't aligned with him. He was generally 2 steps ahead of most people in the house strategically. Like when he saw through Ika's plan and was able to thwart it completely, and he was outplaying John completely, to the point where it led John being resentful, and Candace HOH more than likely helped save his butt. And coming up with a plan to backdoor Kyle, since it would weaken Paul and Adele, since Kyle had more potential as a player. But the issue was, everyone clearly knew that he was the leader of his alliance, so that would have caught up with him eventually, though I don't think it would have happened in week 5 and week 6 without Canada's HOH, since the other side were weaker players and they weren't coming together beforehand. With him pretending to be straight, knowing that he doesn't have the quote-unquote stereotypical appearance of a stereotypical gay person, which is really problematic. I'm not going to further comment on that, but Kenny fulfilled his role in the season fine enough. So, in my opinion, week 7 is a huge improvement over the last 2 weeks, especially with it being two essential titans just going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And it's mainly just due to gameplay and nothing else. Everyone is thinking in their self-interest, everyone's trying to position themselves in the best way possible, and with the pegonging of the first 5 alliance temporarily done, or done for the most part, it was interesting to see how everyone turning on one another was handled. So Sabrina is sent in because all the loyal first 5 members are gone, and Arlie is talking like he automatically has the grand prize and is yelling in the DR the entire time. Annoying as Allison is forced to be a sloppy second since she knows she does not have the numbers and it would not have been a smart move to veto Kenny with her special veto. John wins HOH and everyone in the sloppy seconds are cheering as they all think that they're going to have a week off. Sabrina has a conversation with Arlie about the demise of the first 5 and he BS's her about being a good player and that they would have made it to the end. Sorry, I think he claimed that they would never have made it to the end. Sabrina and Rochelle pitch their case to John about how they could be loyal votes for him and how he will be the targets after they are gone. Sabrina throws her evicted allies under the bus to distance herself from them. John gets tipsy and reveals that Netta is the reason why the condiment was missing, and it was due to her wanting to weaken Kenny as much as possible. She is annoyed since it ruins the perception of the game that she created that she's trying to play, as she wants to be perceived as a weak non-player. John makes a final 2 alliance with Arlie called the Goof Troop, which is a backup alliance, though it apparently was something that they've made a sign of doing all season. Arlie is aware that John cannot control Netta, and John is only telling Arlie this to make him feel comfortable with Netta, but Arlie, simply put, doesn't want Netta at the end. Netta is planning for when the sloppy seconds target one another, so she speaks to Rochelle about wanting her around when the alliance turns on one another. Netta is aware that the pairs are targeted first, which is John and Netta. John ends up nominating Sabrina and Rochelle for eviction, to no one's surprise. Sabrina claims that John lost hers and Rochelle's votes for this in jury, and John does not plan on doing a backdoor on someone else in this alliance at this point. Netta has another plan as she sees Arlie for who he is and has never trusted him throughout the season, so she knows that they have to strike at him first. Allison also knows that she is at the bottom of her alliance and is expendable, so she needs to make a move for herself. Adele decides to use his veto power to replace Allison so he can play in the comp, since he thinks that there's a chance that Allison could use it on one of the gremlins. Allison is rightfully pissed off and does not want to speak to him, since it already validated her thought about her position in the alliance. Allison tells Sabrina and Rochelle that she hopes one of them wins the veto, and she wishes that she never flipped. Netta is pushing to John that Arlie needs to go home next week, but he's not interested in it. John ends up winning the veto and is seemingly listening to Sabrina and Rochelle, where they and Netta and John talk about how there's a plan that they both will be here. John and Netta are telling this to the gremlins. John and Netta talk to Heather about sending Arlie home, and he mentions how Arlie is a huge physical threat. I don't even know why Heather never questioned this, since this could easily have been done to her, and it shows that they're capable of doing this to any of their allies. Netta and Heather tell Allison about the plan to backdoor Arlie, and she is shocked, with it being yet another signal that she has no idea what's going on, and they make decisions and plans without her. John vetoes Rochelle and nominates Arlie as the replacement. Since it is the last veto ceremony, she can use it. Allison uses her secret veto on Sabrina. Everyone is shocked, but John decides to use Adele as the replacement nominee, who doesn't realize that he is also at the bottom of the alliance. So Arlie decides to stay calm about being backstabbed, since he knows it will be better strategically. Adele is not worried, since they are claiming that Arlie is the best player in the house. Of course, Rochelle and Sabrina are happy and cheering about being safe. Arlie is now groveling to Sabrina and Rochelle. Arlie then campaigns to Allison, and she has a conversation with Rochelle about how they should do it, since it will be the 4 of them against Netta and Heather in the next HOH competition. Apparently, Adele and Arlie have always been allies the entire season, according to what Arlie said, and Adele decides to campaign. He campaigns to Allison that he wants to join up with her to go after John and Netta and take her to the final two. I don't remember if he was being genuine about this or not. John and Netta talk to Allison to convince her to vote with them. Netta decides to create a balloon to represent the amount of time Arlie's dying game has, which is funny. From what I gathered online, John and Netta made a fake Final Four deal with Rachel and Sabrina to convince them to vote out Arlie, and they really hammered them down. Arlie is evicted in a 5-0 vote, and he thinks that John made a game-ending move with booting him. He did not know when his game started ending, but that being more transparent in the most recent days or weeks would cause ease within people. Honestly, I don't think Arlie is the great player that everyone in the house has hyped him up to be and how he's hyped himself up to be. While I do think that he was in a great position for the first half of the season, and he had a great ability to float, he never really floated, he just completely flipped, when it would have been beneficial for him to keep at least one or both of Sarah and Kenny around, so they could have made the shots at John and Netta, and then whoever is left of John and Netta could have taken the shot at Kenny and Sarah, kind of like a back and forth. I also feel like he was playing up for the cameras at some point, and he wanted to be the best superfan ever, and he was very performative at times, which kind of got annoying, and I really didn't like his streaking. It was impressive that he convinced the Gremlins and Allison to keep him around, and he didn't make a lot of mistakes. While I don't think he is a great player, I do think he's one of the better players of the season. But he is also one of the people that once you leave the season or onto another, you kind of forget about him. We're in week 8, and there are a few decent moments in here that doesn't make it a complete bore, but you can tell that things are winding down in this season and that it's essentially a steamroll. Netta wins HOH and she is sequestered in the secret room and is able to see the cameras. She sees a worried Sabrina and Allison, who are talking about how they regret voting out Arlie. Netta doesn't see why Allison is so worried if they made a Final Four deal together, probably because she knows you're targeting her, Netta. Aressa tells her the news, and Netta mentions that she was going to put up the Gremlins, but she doesn't trust Allison, and she was second in the HOH competition. She doesn't want to waste an HOH on a Gremlin, doesn't care about keeping her word, and knows that Heather and Adele will still be after a Gremlin. Netta decides to nominate Sabrina and Allison while making a harsh speech to make Allison look untrustworthy, claiming that she has proof of Allison being untrustworthy and that the house needs to get rid of her. Allison is evicted in a vote of 4-0, and when she speaks to Aressa, she was not shocked at all with being evicted, and that she should have stuck with her guns to keep Arlie. As a personality, there really wasn't much there. She's a nice girl, but she never really had a chance to really blend in strategically or socially, though it seemed like she was starting to catch on as the weeks went on. She didn't stick to her guns, as she ended up flipping when she didn't want to, and while she did use the secret veto, she didn't commit in voting out Adele so she could retain control of the narrative. She was severely disadvantaged by missing the first 2 weeks of the season, and then she kind of clung on to Andrew for the few weeks that they were in the house together immediately after her arriving. In general, she's kind of forgettable. She is forgettable, actually. She's not that memorable, and is another victim of the instant eviction. But I feel like people don't talk about her instant eviction as much as they do AJ's and Neha's. Adele wins the HOH competition and immediately tells Sabrina and Rachel that they're going up on the block in a relatively rude manner. Sabrina curses him out and tells him that he swears on Allah about keeping them safe and then breaks it. Adele doesn't care. John and Netta tell Sabrina that she's also a hypocrite because she lied for the first 5 throughout the first half of the season. Right after this, Rachel hosts a dinner where they all talk about their different ethnicities and how they're still all one big family. Adele wants to target Sabrina, but John and Netta convince and pitch to him that Rochelle is the bigger threat and performs better in competitions. To the shock of no one, he nominates the Gremlins, where he makes an obnoxious speech for television, though he claims in the DR that it was actually for strategy so he could be taken to the end. And the Gremlins cry their butts off. Sabrina and Rochelle continue on their meltdown from his speech, and Adele reveals in the DR that his plan is to piss off everyone in the jury, or going to the jury, and having the endgamers wanting to take him to the final 2, and then he'll win the jury over with his speech, which is a very stupid strategy. After Rochelle speaks to Adele, who told her he wanted to make good television, though he claimed in the DR that it wasn't the case, but just to shut her up, we have Sabrina's infamous "You want good TV?" which is a really great moment and is a highlight of the season. We get some filler John and Netta segment about their dynamic, but it leads to John stating that he wants to take her to the final two, and Netta doesn't have the same sentiments since everyone likes John. Adele throws the veto, so he's not seen as a threat, and Netta ends up winning the veto that Peter hosted. Netta is called into the diary room so she can have a strategy session with Emmett and Jillian, where they tell her that when you start to win, you have to keep winning, since John and Netta each have 3 wins at this point. Netta is planning on taking Heather to the end and doesn't want to lie about a final 2 with Adele, since he talks too much and is worried that he'll tell Heather and John, and they lose trust in her as well. Netta, of course, doesn't use the veto. Rochelle does not feel like campaigning, and whenever she does speak, everyone just ignores her. Adele mentions that he isn't even thinking about the next 2 weeks, since he's seeing them as gremlin evictions, and he reiterates his poor plan to win the game. Heather and Netta officiate their final 2 with one another, since they know that they cannot beat the guys, who have great stories. Netta is sure that she does not want to go to the end with John, but wants him in the final 3. Heather talks about her personal life and how the first few weeks brought her to a bad place in her life. But she is glad to find her people in the game and wants to go to the final 3 with John and Netta. When she leaves, they seem open to the idea. Sabrina and Adele start to fight in the hot tub, and we get a flashback of them fighting about religion in the very first week, and then we see a montage of their other fights throughout the season. This leads to their fight in the hot tub. There is a montage of Sabrina and Rochelle throughout the season, and Rochelle mentioning that she'll be friends with Sabrina forever, which didn't happen, and they fell out soon after the season. I don't know if they repair things. Rochelle is evicted in a 3-0 vote. Rochelle was a poor player in the season. She was grouped in with the mean girls, but she didn't seem to officiate anything with any of them outside of Sabrina. She targeted Aika when it was not in her best move to do so, as Aika was a shield for her, so that means that it would have bought Rochelle an extra week. And even after her HOH, she seemed to have completely isolated Netta, which wasn't good, since Netta could have had her back, as she was left in with the first 5 side without ever being aligned to any of them. She just played a very emotional and catty game. Was extremely passive throughout the season, and being passive is not good, especially in a season of a lot of superfans. And personality-wise, she wasn't interesting to me. She was kind of just there. And aside of her bad moves, she's also someone who's pretty forgettable in the grand scheme of Big Brother Canada. It is week 9, and this week was a bore, but it shouldn't be shocking since it is the end game and there are 5 people left. While the physical HOH competition is taking place, everyone is going on about how their games changed from the beginning to now, and it just reminds me how lucky most of these house guests were, which wouldn't have been the case without Canada's HOH. John ends up winning the HOH, and it's clear that Heather is at the bottom of the alliance, since neither John nor Netta wanted her to win HOH, and most of the house wants her out now. I believe everyone in the house wants her out. Sabrina hopes that John targets Heather, and Adele also has a conversation with John about Heather needing to go, and then they have a conversation with Netta about targeting Heather. It seems like all of them came up with this thought on their own about Heather needing to go. John decides to nominate Sabrina and Heather, blindsiding the latter for eviction. Heather doesn't react well to being nominated, which causes John to be annoyed, since her reaction is based on the thought or her thought of being a pawn, despite her being the actual target, and everyone is planning on evicting her. In my opinion, it seems like John just didn't want to feel bad, so he got annoyed with her. Netta plans to take Adele and Sabrina to the end, since she knows that she can beat them both, while she would struggle with beating John, and she knows that Adele and Sabrina would never take one another to the end. Adele is planning on taking John to the end, though I don't know if he's aware that John would actually beat him, and Heather is planning on taking Netta to the end, though I don't know if she's aware that Netta would beat her. Heather goes to see John, since he was avoiding her, and she knows that he would never have spoken to her if she didn't make the first move, like a coward that he is, and he tells some lies to her while she cries. Heather wins the veto when her back was against the wall. Everyone knows Adele is going up, but John and Netta talk about how which out of Sabrina and Adele should be evicted. Netta convinces John that Adele needs to go, despite him being better for John's game, and Netta's aware of this. But she doesn't care. Adele tries to convince John to nominate Netta, but he ultimately fails at this, since he claims that John would follow him at fourth place, but John clearly isn't listening to him and nominates him anyways. Netta wants to keep Sabrina around, but she does not want to push John and Heather, since it would make her look controlling, and she does not want to burn Adele's jury vote. Adele tries to convince everyone that the three jurors would vote for Sabrina, but they clearly are not convinced. With them both on the block, it isn't shocking that there's another montage of their interactions, but it comes off as more playful, friendly writing. Adele uses their cultural similarities, as they're both Islam and both being Middle Eastern North African, as well as coming from family-oriented families, as a reason why he wants her to win and why she deserves it over John and why he should stay, but she only wants strategic reasons as to why she should keep him. After John's task ends, he changes his mind as he now wants Sabrina out over Adele, but it is too late. Adele is evicted by a 2-0 vote. Adele might be the person that I like the most on this season, but in a way he's kind of forgettable too. He's like those favorites in some of those Big Brother seasons where you really, really like them, but as the seasons go on, and if you're not paying attention to that season, you kind of forget how great they are. As a player, Adele kind of sucks. He only latched on to the outsiders throughout the first half of the season, and while Canada liking him became known to the house, that was something that helped him. But it seemed like whenever he tried to do a strategic move, despite having some decent reads, he often had the wrong strategy or the wrong plan. And it didn't seem like the jury respected him enough to give him the win, so he wasn't really a threat either. Still an entertaining character and a house guest, though I do feel like he pandered to Canada way too much, and it made him come off as inauthentic sometimes, despite him having a good heart. So now it is time to talk about week 10, and I would say that it's a pretty good final week, despite usually final weeks not being that interesting because everything's so set in stone. There were a few shocking and emotional moments, so it's definitely up there when we're talking about final weeks. Sabrina ends up winning HOH, meaning that the sloppy seconds have to turn one another. Heather still believes that she has the final three with John and Netta, as she's just ignoring cues and the fact that they prematurely cut three of their own allies early and she was going home last week if she didn't win the veto. John is annoyed that Netta spilled the beans to Adele about going home when they all agreed to blindside him. It is clear that this was around the time John started to turn against Netta and to prioritize himself, since he knew that she only did that move for herself and to up her jury chances. John and Heather are really annoyed about Sabrina winning HOH, and John immediately regrets booting Adele. Netta isn't mad about Sabrina winning HOH, since she wants to split up the three, but pretends to be upset about it, though she hates not having control in general, so that's an element that did annoy her. Sabrina ends up nominating John and Heather for eviction. Sabrina and Heather pitch an all-girl final three, and Netta is not interested in it at all, since she thinks Heather and Sabrina would take one another over her. John and Heather also make a fake final two with one another. John ends up winning the veto, as Heather rejects a round of How Bad Do You Want It, which would have put her in the lead, and he tells Heather that he is voting her out. Like Tala in the last season, we have to see her deal with her game being over, and she cries in a pillow, which was just heartbreaking to watch, as she doesn't want the experience to end. John does vote Heather out. So, I feel like I've kind of mentioned this a few times, but I will say it for Heather, since I feel it applies to Heather. I forget how likable she is until I watch the season. When I'm not watching the season, I kind of forget about her, and I really forget about how nice and rootable of a person she is. So, while she's nice and while she's likable, she's kind of forgettable in a way. As a player, I don't really think she's a good player, though I don't really think she's a bad player. If anything, she's around mediocre, but I'm not too sure about where I feel about her as a player. Her social game was horrendous in the first few weeks since no one trusted her strategically and a lot of people just didn't like her. And while she did stay in week 3 and week 4, it had nothing to do with anything that she did. And I do feel like Canada's HOH helped her tremendously, where she wasn't hated and it put her in a position where people wanted to work with her since she was not in the first 5 alliance. Strategically, I do think she made a few blunders, and I do think she ignored a lot of signs throughout the season, but by the end of the game, she did become a jury threat, and she did show that she could win some competitions or do well in them if she needed to. Overall, she's a likable person, and definitely one of the standouts. Though I do think she has gotten lost in time. The final 3 pitched their cases to win to Canada, who is the final juror. Sabrina mentions that she was in the first 5 alliance, was nominated 6 times, used her social game to stay, and won the final 4 HOH. Neda mentions that she was watching the show since she was little, made strong moves, sent home big players, and was never in danger. John mentions that he did not know much about the game, had to be more observant, broke his arm, won a lot of competitions, and started playing hard when Andrew was nominated, while sending home Arlie and Adele. John wins part 1 of the final HOH, and he makes a final 2 deal with Sabrina. Neda, of course, wins part 2 of the final HOH. It's hilarious seeing Neda and John celebrate their quote-unquote guaranteed final 2. John ends up winning the final HOH and shockingly cuts Neda. Neda is clearly the star of the season, strategically and personality-wise. You really get into her story. She is really rootable, and it was so rare seeing just a badass superfan take over and kick names and be unapologetic about being a ruthless game player who was out for herself. Watching this after BBCAN2, I realized that a lot of her negative traits that were in that season are definitely in here too, especially since she was with the Mean Girls for the first 4 weeks, and she makes a lot of snarky and kind of rude comments about the other house guests at times. But she did learn to have fun. She started warming up as the game went on. I really loved how on point she was strategically. She was very self-aware about what she needed to, how her perception was, how she wanted to be perceived, and how she was going to change people's perception as the jury phase went on. She continues the trend of BBCAN having a fallen angel, especially in the early seasons, and she's really just a strong person, a strong woman, and a strong player. Neda made Big Brother Canada 2 what it is. And while it is unfortunate what happened to her in BBCAN2, though watching this now, I do think her social game is her weakest aspect, even in this season. Neda ran this game, and yeah, she's very great. It is time for the jury deliberation, and Arlie asks John who gained the most from Arlie leaving the game, and John admitted that it made it a harder road for him, but it was a choice that he and Neda made. Allison asks Sabrina if it was a good decision to be honest about the strategic decisions she made throughout the game, and Sabrina said yes it was, since it made her more transparent to people. Rochelle asks John if his strategy was more than being popular and liked, and John admitted that because he didn't know much about the strategy or the game at first, he wanted to be the goofy guy to see where it got him initially. Adele asks Sabrina about how being nominated by Canada affected psychologically, and Sabrina mentioned that it gave her a wake-up call to distance herself from other people and to reevaluate everything. Heather asks Sabrina if she really cries on cue or if it was just strategy, and Sabrina admits that's just who she is. Neda asks John what moves he made on his own outside of evicted her, and John mentions that he evicted Arlie, Adele, Heather, and her, so that was 4 moves he made without her. John mentions that he didn't know much about the game, but he always played the game. He knew that he had to win himself to get to the end and to become more observant. Sabrina says that she created the first 5 alliance, was put up 6 times, and had to find a way to get to the end. John wins by a 6-1 vote. Sabrina is such a mixed bag. While she is entertaining at times, she's also very irritating, annoying, and unlikable at times as well, and made things quite uncomfortable. Strategically, she wasn't as great as she thought she was, but she did take action at certain points, and she did get a few things done. It was clear from early on that she was a goat, and rewatching it, I saw why that perception took place, and I realized that it started earlier than a lot of people thought, or at least I thought, while watching it in the past. She is definitely one of the more memorable people in Big Brother Canada, even after all of these years. John is like a more likable Emmett and Jillian, in my opinion. Or when I say likable, I mean a lot more goofy. He didn't know much about the game, he had to learn on the ropes. He became aligned with a strategist, Neda, and he was close to the guys at first, but then he had to distance himself from them. I do think up to Canada's HOH, he was playing in a way that would have gotten himself evicted and outplayed, but he did win the competition, the veto competition in Canada's HOH. So if that was a normal HOH, chances are he would have won anyways. There were a lot of decisions that he made that were controlled by Neda. He made a lot of choices, like Jillian, that were not in his best interest, but against his best interest. But it seems like he turned it around at the end, and I didn't realize it until now, but you easily see when he had that switch against Neda, and when he became more self-realized. John's definitely a likable, fun character, and he had a deserving win here. So, going through everything, I definitely feel more confident in saying that Big Brother Canada 2 is a better, stronger season than Big Brother Canada 1, though I don't think it's much stronger. Like I mentioned earlier, I really don't like the Canadian influence twists, and I feel like it altered the gameplay to the point where a lot of people started aligning with people based on who Canada liked, and Canada's HOH cost for a lot of the more mediocre at best players to make it to the end. And I mentioned that I don't like how they edited out a lot of the drama. But in general, the production value is a lot better, making it a much easier watch. The cast, while kind of top heavy, more top heavy than I realized, is still a strong, likable cast. You can get into all of them, and the strategy was definitely more interesting this season than it was last season. So I'm going to rank the BBCAN2 players as players and rank them into tiers like I did with BBCAN 1 and my total drama cast. So that's something that should be out in a few days. Thank you all for supporting me in this journey and watching this video, and I'll be back with something soon. Take care.